Welcome to Module 3, which is the review of the 2019-20 Baldrige Criteria Framework. You're going to need to have a copy of the Baldrige Excellence Framework, the criteria booklet, in front of you during this module, because essentially our objectives here are to walk you through it, to help you understand the criteria structure, the 17 items and the point values associated with them, the organizational profile and how it's used within our evaluation, the hierarchy within the various criteria items themselves, what we refer to as the basic, overall, and multiple criteria questions, the notes that are associated with each criteria item and how they're helpful to examiners in their evaluation, the Adly and Let's See scoring guidelines that we use to inform our evaluation and our scoring of an applicant, the core values and concepts that underlie the entire framework, as well as the glossary that will become one of your constant reference points. So make sure you have a copy of the criteria booklet as we go through this. Just to set things up here, the criteria were originally created in the late 80s, early 90s, essentially as a means to evaluate or assess the organizations who were applying for the original Baldrige Award. And to this day, they are still organizations apply for either the Baldrige or IMEC Award, and our examiners evaluate them based on their achievement and improvements relative to the criteria. These criteria are provided to applicants as a set of questions that address the 7 categories or critical aspects of managing an organization. I'll introduce you to those 7 categories in just a moment. They're non-prescriptive. The criteria do not tell you what you must or should do. They let organizations choose the most suitable tools, processes, and structures. The reason they're able to be non-prescriptive is that they focus on meeting common needs of high-performing organizations rather than implementing common procedures. In this way, applicant organizations are encouraged to develop their own innovative approaches to meeting these needs rather than simply following what others might be doing. The criteria also focus on results. It's worth noting, as you'll see in a minute, almost half of the total points allotted are for actual results achieved. And these criteria, though they were created in 1989 or so, they've been revised every 2 years to reflect the leading edge of validated practices. And I think it's safe to say that they are recognized internationally as representing validated practices for achieving performance excellence. Now, there are 3 different versions of the criteria. The blue version is the business, which is used for manufacturing, service, nonprofit, and government organizations. The red is the education criteria, and purple is the healthcare criteria. So hospitals would use the purple, schools would use the red, and almost everyone else would use the blue. Our case study, the LifeBridge Organ and Transplant Sharing, is a nonprofit organization, and so we'll be using the blue business criteria for our evaluation of that organization. If, when we get into the evaluation process and you're assigned an applicant who's in education, you would want to use the education criteria. If you were assigned a hospital, use the healthcare criteria. But for our case study, you'll all be provided a copy of the business criteria booklet. So hopefully you've got that handy now and can use it, follow along as we go through it. So turn to page 1 of your criteria booklet, and you'll see a diagram like the one shown here. It's often referred to as the hockey puck, represents the performance excellence system at the category level. So you keep an eye on this page in your booklet as I talk you through this system that's reflected here in these 7 categories on the next slide. So categories 1 through 6 are the 6 approach categories, whereas category 7 is the results category. And the performance excellence system that's embodied in these categories works like this. Category 1, senior leaders are expected to set clear direction and expectations for an organization. In category 2, that direction gets embodied in clear plans and strategies and budgets. And in category 3, those strategies better be focused on meeting the needs of your external customers and markets. So categories 1, 2, and 3 set the direction, figure out how you're going to get there, and make sure you're meeting customer needs. This reflects the leadership triad. Regardless of what industry or sector you serve or your competitive situation, you meet customer needs and implement strategy through skilled, motivated workforce and efficient, effective operations or work processes. And you need integration between your leadership triad on the front end and your results triad on the back end. It is your people and your processes that will ultimately produce results. And what ties all this together is often the foundation that is your Category 4 measurement, analysis, and knowledge management. It produces the results that get reported in Category 7, and it provides senior leaders with the feedback to understand the extent to which they're achieving the desired outcomes and strategic direction. This is a generic model applicable to any organization and end industry. What makes it unique or specific to a particular organization is clarified for us in the organizational profile, which I'll introduce you to in a moment. The organizational profile asks applicants a series of context questions. What's your mission, vision, values? What's your workforce profile? What are your customer groups and market segments, and what are their key requirements? These organizational profile questions help us understand the unique challenges or situation facing our applicant, and it's through that lens that we apply our evaluation of the criteria to that specific applicant organization. Now, what's represented here are the 7 categories that comprise the performance excellence system within the Baldrige criteria framework. Our evaluation of organizations actually occurs one level down at what we call the item level. So you have categories, items, and areas to address. Let's double click on the categories and go down one level to the items. So we have 17 items. There are 2 items within each of the process categories and 5 items within Category 7 results. You can see those 12 approach items in blue and the 5 results items in red on this particular slide. And let me point out that there's a certain symmetry to the items, the sequencing of items within a category. Category 2 is probably the best example of this. You must first develop your strategy in 2.1 before you implement it in 2.2. In Category 3, customers, you must first listen to customers to understand their needs and expectations in 3.1 before in 3.2 you go on to build relationships with them and provide them with products and services that meet those needs. Again, all of this is put through the lens of the organizational profile that provides context for our evaluation. And our evaluation, as I mentioned before, occurs at the item level. If you now flip to page 3 in your criteria booklet, you'll see a table that looks similar to this. This is actually from the healthcare criteria, but very similar other than a few minor word changes. These are the 7 categories with the items within each one and the point values associated with each of these items. I'll talk about scoring in a minute, but you can see each item has a different point value assigned to it. So item 1.1, senior leadership, is worth 70 points maximum. Item 1.2, governance and societal contributions, is worth 50. What's worth noting here is that categories 1 through 6, if you total up the points, represent 550 of 1,000 total points. You can see that the Category 7 results represents 45% or 450 of the 1,000 points. This criteria framework requires an organization to be good, not just look good, as demonstrated through this emphasis, a clear emphasis on achievement of results. Continuing on, if you turn the next page, you'll see the organizational profile beginning on category page 4. Pages 4, 5 represent, and you'll see there's basically 5 areas here: the organizational environment, P1A, P1B is organizational relationships, P2A on the next page, competitive environment, P2B, the strategic context, and P2C, performance improvement system. So this is a little summary of what's covered in the organizational profile. I'd like to draw your attention to the right side of the slide where you see the actual questions from the organizational profile excerpted. And I'd ask, what's the first word in each of the questions within the organizational profile? Yes, you're correct. The word what shows up in almost every question within the org profile. So these are what we call context questions. So within the org profile, we ask the applicant, what are your main product service offerings? What's your mission, vision, values, etc. Within the criteria itself, categories 1 through 6, we'll ask how questions. How do you develop products and services? How do you set your vision and values? How do you determine the key drivers of engagement for your workforce, et cetera, et cetera. So we do not evaluate the answers in the organizational profile. Instead, they provide context for our evaluation. The team leads and work group leads within in the examiner team will use the organizational profile information to develop what we call key factors. And some of these are determined to be priority key factors, which then inform our selection of priority criteria questions to consider in our evaluation. And so the org profile sort of sets the context for our evaluation, and our lead examiners use it. You'll be learning more about that as we go on to make sure that our evaluation focuses on the areas of most importance to our applicant. If we continue working through the criteria booklet, you can flip pages and quickly start to understand this hierarchy. I've already introduced the fact that there are 7 categories. Category 1 is leadership. That category consists of 2 items at the next level down. Item 1.1, senior leadership. Item 1.2, governance and societal responsibility. So we have 7 categories, 17 items, and within those items, there's a great many areas to address. And within those areas to address is where all the multiple questions live. So this next level so we have categories, items, and areas to address is one hierarchy. The hierarchy that is perhaps most important for examiners to understand is the hierarchy of criteria questions within an individual item. Within an item, we have 3 levels of criteria questions, what we call the basic at the item level, the overall questions, which are often at the area level, and then the full detailed set of remaining questions are the multiples. So as you see, and I'll show you another example, and then I'll show you how this informs our scoring of applicants, etc. But understanding is the applicant responding at the basic overall multiple level, is the appropriate feedback at the basic overall multiple level. This is an important thing for examiners to discern. So let me spend a minute here and ask you to bear with me. On this next slide, which really excerpts page 7 from the criteria, senior leadership, item 1.1, you will notice the 3 different levels of requirements are highlighted here. So the basic is highlighted in blue. This is at the item level. How do your senior leaders lead the organization is the basic criteria question. It summarizes the item as a whole. The overall criteria questions are the first bold-faced question within each set of multiple questions. So I've highlighted those in yellow here on the screen, but you can see in your criteria booklet they're highlighted in terms of being bold-faced. So the first question in each area is the overall, and then all the other questions that follow the overall are considered the multiple criteria questions. Again, why this is important, if you look at 1.1b, the overall question is how do senior leaders communicate with and engage the entire workforce, partners, and customers. Below that are multiple requirements that essentially take that further. How do these communication methods, or how do they encourage frank two-way communication, communicate key decisions, et cetera, et cetera? Well, if an applicant did not have effective systematic processes to communicate with, let's say, key partners or key customers, they did for workforce, but not the other 2. Our feedback would focus on that failing. We would give feedback at that overall level, lacking a systematic, effective approach to communicate with key partners and customers. We would not then get into these non-existent approaches also don't encourage frank two-way communication or communicate the key decisions. So this becomes important in terms of we want to make sure organizations are addressing the basic questions first, then the overall, and then the multiple. Now in practice, because the basic are so basic, how do senior leaders lead the organization, rarely do you find organizations that don't have an effective approach for something at that basic level. But often you do find that they might not be meeting a certain overall requirement, which would make that a priority over some of the multiples that may be lacking. Now, if you look at the bottom of that page, you'll see a series of notes that are shown here on this slide. And these notes are simply helpful. They are not criteria. You do not evaluate an organization relative to information in the notes, but the notes are intended to be helpful to you as an examiner and to applicants to further expound on the criteria. So for example, in 1.1b, we talked about senior leader communication methods and the multiple requirement being two-way communication. You can see the note here gives you an example of what some types of methods for two-way communication might be, including the use of social media, tweets, blogging, et cetera, et cetera. So again, just helpful information. Don't hesitate to use the notes, but don't evaluate as if these are actual criteria questions. These are simply there to be helpful to examiners and applicants alike. Now, it's important if you're going to be evaluating an organization relative to the criteria for you to begin understanding the criteria. And so I'm going to give you an individual assignment to complete. It's fairly simple, about 30 minutes is what it will take you. And it'll help you build your mental model of the criteria as well as increase your understanding of the overall criteria questions. So what I'm going to ask you to do is go through the overall criteria questions. Read each of the overall criteria questions in category 1 through 6. There are 12 items. Read each of those overall criteria questions within each of the item and ask yourself, for this question, what's the key system or process the criteria is asking me for in this overall question? And then within that overall criteria question, highlight the 3 to 4 words that capture the essence of the system or process being required. When looking for systems, processes, it's often helpful to look for verb-object pairs. So for example, in 1.1a1, it asks about how senior leaders set vision and values, right? That I would argue that set vision values is the essence of the overall criteria in 1.1a1, just like demonstrating commitment is the essence of the overall criteria question in 1.1a2. Communicate and engage is the essence of 1.1b, etc. So you can choose different essence if you want. I'm simply asking you to go through and highlight them. So shown here is an example of what your criteria booklet might look like after you've completed this exercise. Here I've pulled out a piece of item 3.1 from the healthcare criteria. And you can see that in 3.1a1, I determined and highlighted listen to patients is the essence of what's being asked for in the overall criteria question for 3.1a1. And listen to potential patients is the essence of the overall criteria question in 3.1a2. So you can see that I'm asking you to simply use your criteria book for this assignment, get a highlighter, go through, read each of the overall questions, look for those verb-object pairs. You don't have to be creative here, just identify and highlight the essence for each overall question in Cat 1.6. It's a quick way, 30 minutes or so, to introduce yourself to all the criteria in categories 1 through 6. And the other benefit is that by doing so, by completing this exercise, you start to build your own personal cheat sheet to the criteria so that when you continue to review to them frequently throughout this process, you'll be able to quickly get at what's the essence of each of these areas to address the overall criteria questions within each of the items, at least in Cat 1 through 6. So try and get that done before our first virtual training session and the new examiner training and upcoming in May. Now, if I could ask you to skip to page 32 of your criteria booklet, you will see the scoring guidelines for process categories 1 through 6. On the adjacent page of the scoring guidelines for category 7, here we have the scoring guidelines for process categories 1 through 6. You will note that there are 6 score bands. 0 to 5 is a band, 10 to 25 is a score band, 30 to 45, etc. Our approach to scoring is to first determine which band is the best fit, and then what percentage score in 5-point increments would be the best score within that band. So 50, 55, 60, or 65 might be the score if we were in the 50 to 65 band, as an example. Now, what's hard to tell on this slide is that essentially what's embedded within the scoring guidelines for category 1 through 6 is a very important acronym that we call Adly. So Adly stands for Approach, Deployment, Learning, and Integration. Here I've excerpted out the three middle bands in the scoring guidelines. And let me just show you how these play out. Within each band, you will see 4 bullets. And at the end of each bullet, you have an A, a D, an L, and an I. Within the 30 to 45 band, 4 bullets, A, D, L, I. 50 to 65, 4 bullets, A, D, L, I, etc. And you will note within the approach, the A band, the first bullet in each of these, there's a slightly different focus. So the 30 to 45 band, you're looking for effective systematic approaches that are responsive to the basic question. 50 to 65, effective systematic approach responsive to the overall. And 70 to 85, effective systematic responsive to all the multiple questions in the item. So you can see this hierarchy of basic, overall, and multiple shows up in the criteria. It also shows up in the scoring guidelines. And your evaluation of Adly, when you review applicant information in both written and at site visit, will be to look for, is the approach here meeting the basic, overall, or multiple questions? Is it deployed? Are they learning how to do this approach better? And is this approach aligned or integrated with others? So this focus on Adly, if there's one thing you take away from examiner training, it will be a clear understanding of Adly. We'll be providing you additional resources on Adly and doing exercises to help you begin to understand the maturity of approach deployment learning, particularly approach and learning, as we move forward in the process. Adly is incredibly important to our evaluation. It informs our evaluation of processes in categories 1 through 6. The applicant writes a narrative that describes how they do things, i.e. what's their process for listening to customers or developing strategies. We evaluate whatever they write in terms of their approach. Is it systematic and effective? Deployment. Is that approach deployed consistently throughout the organization? Learning. Are they evaluating and improving that approach? Have they gotten better at it? And if so, how did they go about it? And integration is, does that approach meet the organization's needs, and is it aligned with other items? So for example, your complaint management process might be an approach that's aligned with service training that you provide customer service employees, or performance management, or new product development. Your complaints might inform changes to product service offerings, etc. Essentially, Adly, the A, D, and L are applied to an individual process. Is this process systematic, effective, deployed, and have they improved it? Integration has more to do with, is this approach designed in such a way that it meets the organization's needs, often as described in the org profile, and is it aligned with other items, with processes and other items? The AD&L is very similar to PDCA, Plan, Do, Check, Act, which many of you are likely to be familiar with. Plan, Do, Check, Act is probably the most common approach to continuous improvement out there. Plan would correspond to the approach here. You get a plan, get an approach, do it, deploy it, and then learning for us in Adly is similar to check, evaluation, and act, improve the approach itself. So you can think of ADL as kind of applying PDCA to each of the processes within category 1 through 6, and integration is about connecting those processes together in an effective, meaningful manner. Now, just like Adly is the way we evaluate processes in categories 1 through 6, LETC is the acronym that summarizes the dimensions by which we evaluate results. You can see LETC show up on page 33, the results scoring guideline. LETC stands for level, trend, comparison, and integration. You can see that, again, there are 4 bullets in each band, and each bullet corresponds to one of those 4 dimensions: first level, then trend, then comparison, and then integration. We'll be learning much more about this as we go. But just quickly, it should be clear that if an applicant reported 92% of their customers were satisfied, in the current survey, that would be a level. If it had improved from 84% a year ago to 92% today, that would demonstrate a trend. If they showed us that their key competitor or industry benchmark was 90% satisfaction. That would be a comparison that showed they were outperforming the comparison. So level, trend, and comparison, we look at individual results. Is it a good level? Is there an improvement trend? And how did they report an appropriate comparison? And how is their performance relative to that comparison? Integration has more to do with the totality of results reported for a particular item. So Adly is our mental model for the dimensions through which we evaluate processes. Let's-see is the dimensions by which we evaluate results in category 7. Each of these, based on our assessment of Adly and Let's-see, we give an applicant a score from 0 to 100% for each item. Those percentage scores are multiplied by the item point values, which I showed you previously, to give a total number of points for a particular applicant in each item. Those total up somewhere between 0 and 1,000. It's worth pointing out that if an applicant got 50% for every single item, obviously they would end up with a score of 500 points, and that's a very good score. 500 points would likely get you, qualify you for potentially for a silver award in the IMEC recognition program. Baldrige award recipients are often in the 650 to 800 point range, as are IMEC gold recipients. So nobody's at 100, very few people are at 0. Most everybody's in between, and 50 points for an item, 500 points total is a good score. Now, if you continue, move ahead to page 38 in your criteria booklet, you will see the core values and concepts. There are 11 of them that are shown here on this slide that are described there. These are the beliefs, behaviors that are embedded in high-performing organizations. I would argue that the content here under core values and concepts is sort of the foundational underpinnings of the criteria. These are not criteria. We do not evaluate organizations relative to information here, but you will see a lot of the content from the core values and concepts show up in different ways within the criteria themselves. You'll notice that one of the core concepts is customer-focused excellence in the business criteria. It's referred to as patient-focused excellence in healthcare and student-focused excellence in the student criteria. Otherwise, there are very few differences other than language in the core values and concepts. It's often a helpful starting point to read through these. It's only a few pages of information on these 11 core concepts, to read through them to get a good understanding of kind of the foundational underpinnings of the criteria before you get into the deep dive of the criteria themselves. Flipping ahead to page 46 in your criteria booklet, you will find the glossary. And what you see, essentially, these are just common terms defined, right? What you see here on this slide is illustrating the fact that every time a word shows up in the criteria in all caps, that's a signal to you that that term is defined in the glossary. So here in the example I've given from item 1.1, the words senior leaders, vision, values, leadership system, workforce, these are all defined for you in the glossary. I have excerpted the definition of senior leaders on this page to show you how you can connect these terms in all caps in the criteria with their glossary definitions. It's important to understand that the criteria use many common terms with specific intent or meaning, so it's important for you and applicants as well to understand what does the criteria mean by their use of these terms and make sure that you're aligned with their definition of them. So make the glossary your friend, refer to it often, and you will find it to be a very effective and useful habit to have. I've pulled out some of the key terms from the glossary here that you should make yourself familiar with because they relate directly to Adly. We just talked about Adly and the importance of understanding approach, deployment, learning, and integration. Here are some of the terms from the glossary directly related. So approach being methods used to carry out a process. When we look at approach, what we want to know is that approach systematic and effective? Deployment is the applicability of that approach across the organization. Learning is whether or not you're getting better, learning how to get better at that and improving the approach. And then alignment and consistency both have to do with integration, the I dimension of Adly. You can see essentially that alignment is kind of a lower level. Integration goes beyond alignment to harmonization of plans processes. So make sure you familiarize yourself, because Adly is so important to us. At the very least, review some of these key Adly terms in the glossary. All right, so we've now completed, this was our third of 3 self-paced training modules that I'd like you to have under your belt before we get to our first virtual training session. For new examiners, it'll be one session, and all examiners the next. Prior to that first virtual training session, please complete the assignment you were given today. Review the criteria, categories 1 through 6. Read each of the overall criteria questions and highlight the 2 or 3 words, often verb-object pairs, that represent in your mind the essence of that. It'll be a helpful cheat sheet for you as we get into using your criteria booklet. Review some of the key terms in the glossary. Make sure you read the LOTS case study. LOTS stands for LifeBridge Organ and Transplant Services. Make sure you read that case study. New examiners are asked only to read it, paying special attention to the org profile and a few items that either Holly or I will be informing you will be the focus of our pre-work. That's to be determined still. Returning examiners will have more to do, since you won't be attending new examiner training. You'll want to actually use your criteria grid to complete the pre-work for those assigned items, and we'll be giving you that information soon. I hope this has been helpful to you, and as I said, we'll be meeting soon virtually, and look forward to learning and working with each of you as we go forward.